Today I'm building a pit droid, as requested by longtime patron Martin Madsen. Here we go! For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, dowel foam, bevel foam, triangle foam, clay foam, coffee foam, putty, paint, super glue, hot glue, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. Gonna make an attempt to do this in some sort of coherent order this time, and start from the ground up, literally, by making the feet first. So first I made templates and traced them onto EVA foam. These are available, linked in the video description down below. I flipped the template to get the opposite side, and then I cut those out with the work knife, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I'm also being careful to make sure that my blade is angled perfectly straight up and down. This will keep the edges straight. When the pieces were all cut out, I layered them on top of one another and glued them together with hot glue. Layering like this will create the correct depth and make the whole thing sturdier overall. I weighted the floor mats down with machinist blocks so the foam doesn't slide around while I'm working. This build you can get away with not using contact cement because there's not a lot of tension on any of these seams trying to pull them apart. Contact cement is really more for costumes that need to be able to flex as you move around in them. It's not really an issue when it comes to droids. I put a shallow cut in the upper leg piece so that I could bevel the front facing portion, just add a little bit of dimensionality to it. Then I added glue so that the bevel would hold that shape. Now that those two pieces were complete, I joined them at the knee and used a wooden skewer to create the hinge. I simply pressed it into the center of the foam and chopped it down to size with side cutters. And there we go, we got a leg. Although I did make a mistake right here. The ankle joint has to be just as narrow as the knee in order to fit inside the foot. So I fixed that by removing two of the layers and transferring that change back to my templates before uploading them. See, that's why I like EVA foam. It's very forgiving. Now for the foot. I cut a basic two-dimensional foot profile and built up the sides to give it some depth using the puzzle strips that come off of the sides of new sheets of EVA foam. I hot glued those on, again holding them in place with metal blocks. When the glue was dry, I sanded off the leftover puzzle piece flash from when I trimmed them off earlier, making the surface totally flat. Then I covered it with the left side of the foot. And when the glue had set up, I had a foot which I can now attach to the leg. Now that's somewhat lacking in detail, so I'm gonna add some toes out of 4mm foam. I said 4mm foam, there we go, you got it. It's up to you how much detail you wanna actually add. The amount of detail on the pit droids changes depending on whether you're watching live action or animation, but on the feet, the details actually add some stability, so I consider them necessary. I found some brown 2mm foam, so I used it where applicable. Whenever possible, I like to allow a foam that's the same color as the final prop, because it saves me time later on during the painting process. Once the whole leg was complete, I repeated the process for the other leg. Now for the body. I started by tracing the side panel template onto a sheet of foam and cutting it out. I flipped that template to get the other side, symmetrical. Then I cut panels out of the 2mm foam to create the slight topographical variation in the droid's surface. It's actually somewhat similar to the battle droids in that sense. The pit droids are sort of like smaller, simplified battle droids in terms of their design aesthetic. Most of the joints are slightly rounded, so I'm gonna use these EVA foam spheres to make those. These are actually cat toys. I never have to carve circles ever again. Although now that I have them, I have a cat infestation. What have I done? I attached the half sphere at the shoulder. Next, I cut the back panel, which is sort of an H shape, and I glued the sides to it. Then I closed up the front with panels that were slightly narrower than the back, thus creating a mild inward angle in the front. I used more scrap puzzle strip foam to close up the tops of the shoulders. This is mostly structural, as these are going to get covered up later on. The neck joints are actually far above the body cavity, so I made those out of a foam dowel from the craft store. I cut sections from it, and then cut one side flat, just so it has more surface area to glue to the body. If you try to just glue a round surface to a flat one, then that's the amount of weight that has to support. It's gonna break right off, unless you cut it flat. I added a few L-shaped panels to the shoulders, made out of more scrap 2mm foam. I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself here. Before moving on to the neck and the head, I need to build this needlessly complicated abdomen section. This is just the prop designers making it difficult for me. See, that's their main concern when designing robots. How do we make this difficult for William Shakespeare? I'm not full of myself. I really wanted to use pool noodles for this, just to keep in line with the foam theme, but the texture would just be completely wrong and they're not sturdy enough. So instead, I used scrap PVC pipe. I mean, you could just make a foam cylinder. It's included in the template pattern, but that's actually slightly more work than is really necessary. I try to be consistent with the materials that I use, but there's just so much scrap material just off camera, just begging to be used in a project. Just be thankful I didn't make the thing out of wood, which has its own drawbacks. I drilled a hole through it for the abdomen hinges. Then I traced a circle that would fit inside its diameter. I cut it out and refined it on my belt sander. I actually cut out a bunch of identical circles, but that won't come into play until later. For now, I'm just using 2 of them to close up the ends of the PVC cylinder. Because the front end of the cylinder is supposed to be bigger, I cut out a couple of wider diameter circles to go on that end. It's also supposed to be rounded, so first I cut an angle into the top circle using a box cutter, forming a very shallow and jagged cone. I know this looks terrible right now, but it'll cut way down on the dust once I get around to sanding. Then I glued it on. The under circle? Sure, why not? Now that obviously looks terrible, so first I'm gonna trim the edges with scissors, and then I'm gonna sand that into a rounded shallow dome on the belt sander. Sometimes when you sand foam, you get these fuzzies on the edge. I get a lot of questions about what to do about those, and just peel them off. Just peel them off. Just like that. Just like that. Mystery solved. The hinge that this piece has to pivot on needs to be sharp on both ends, so I whittled the other end into a point. Wait, what am I doing? There we go. Right tool for the right job. Speaking of, this is a hole punch. I'm using it to punch a hole. I'm gonna take the offcut and use it to disguise the otherwise exposed wooden part of the hinge. Also adds a little bit of tension to that hinge, which, believe me, is incredibly helpful. Next, I needed to make a lower cylinder that's identical in diameter, but oriented perpendicularly to the top one, to the belly button one. So same thing, although this time I filled the whole thing on the interior with circles because that will increase the tension on the wooden skewer for the hips. This will help hold the droid upright. To connect the two, I used hot glue and scrap foam. Because it has these annoying slants to it, I used offcuts from the B2 Roomba build, and knew those would come in handy, to create that ridiculous semi-pyramid shape. Then I used more cat toys, shoot, to make ball and socket joints. I also had some 2mm foam there, just because. Next, I'm gonna make the arms. I cut the upper arms out of floor mat foam using my templates. They're 2 layers deep. I glued them together with a metal hole strip in between them. Then I cut another dowel segment for the shoulder, and I glued it on. For support and detail, I cut a slanted piece of foam for the armpit. I glued it on and then trimmed down the metal. The forearms are somewhat more complicated. For those, I'm gonna use a longer dowel segment. The animated version of the pit droids have forearms that are half the length of the movie version, so you're gonna have to make a decision as to what looks right to you. I capped off the ends with hemispheres. Oh god, the cats are back! To widen the arms, I cut a piece of 4mm craft foam to wrap around them. In order to get the alcove in the side, I cut a half oval out of each end of that 4mm arm piece. To keep it from trying to unravel from the arm as I work on it, I heat formed it with my heat gun and stuck it in a pipe for a few minutes so that it would hold that shape. Almost got through this entire build without heat forming. Not that I have anything against heat forming, it's just getting tired of getting burned, you know? Maybe you should be more careful. Never! Then I wrapped it around the arm and glued it together. Because there's so much stress on this, still trying to pull it apart, I had to glue around the edge of the alcove in stages. Otherwise, it could easily turn into a mess. See, the super glue is stronger than the foam, so if you try to just clasp down on it with a closed fist, then you'll glue yourself to your prop and it'll tear apart while you're trying to free yourself. Next, to simulate mechanical components, I added layered strips of 2mm foam to the alcove. Finally, I trimmed another piece of metal for the forearms joint. These tin snips are so much better than the other ones. Should have started out with them. Make armor out of these, like metal armor. Then I connected the forearm to the upper arm with a hinge made from foam, circles, and a skewer. There we go, we have an arm. For the wrist, I used smaller foam dowels and connected them with a combination of toothpicks and super glue. Then I made the fingers. They consist of segments that are only 1 layer of foam deep. They only have 3 fingers per hand, so that's fairly simple. One at a time, I glued them to a cylinder segment, which will act as the knuckles. There's a slanted divot at the end of each fingertip, which sort of is like a reverse fingernail, really. You don't actually need joints in all the knuckles, so the middle knuckles are cosmetic. They're made out of more hole punch offcuts. I glued the thumb straight onto the wrist and then slid each finger over the toothpick so that they could articulate. And now the arm has a hand. For the other one, wash, rinse, and repeat. You don't even really need to worry about left-right symmetry because it's, you know, they're reversible. Just turn the hand turn around. Okay, now I can move on to the neck. First, I cut a hinge from a dowel. You can get these at craft stores, by the way, or online. Since it's this narrow beam that has to support the entire weight of the head, I needed to put a sturdy support on the inside. So for that, I used a cut up paint stir stick. Pay no attention to the blaster in the background or that TIE fighter in the foreground. You know what, just, can we get a soft focus? Yeah, all right, there we go. I can set deck. Gotta do something about this storage problem. I rounded off one end and then cut up foam pieces to build out the sides. I glued those all together. There are rounded inset pipes in the neck, so for that, I used a foam half dowel or bevel. So there's this heat sink in the neck, and I bet you'll never guess how I'm gonna make that. Foam triangle! I glued 4 foam triangle bevel strip segments to the base of the neck and wrapped them around so that they connected in the back. They didn't all match up, because I was just sort of eyeballing this. So there was some trimming and filling to get them to work, but that's to be expected. The seams on the neck were a bit too distracting to me, so I chose to cover those up with 2mm craft foam. Now for the head. I started with a circle for the base and traced another one for the dome. Then I heat formed that and pressed it into a metal bowl. I weighted that down until it cooled. When it cooled, I removed it and it retained its shape. You'll notice that it's a little too much like a hubcap. It should look a bit more like a classic UFO shape, like a day the Earth stood still shape. To fix it, I cut out leaves and re-glued those seams together. Then I had to refine the edge in order to get it back to a circular brim, and to both cover the seam while also recovering some of the diameter that I lost during this process. I added back a bevel. Now this is me figuring out a shape from scratch, and nobody else needs to go through that hassle. So after the whole debacle, I made a custom head panel template so that you guys don't have to deal with that. I stacked some scrap foam in the inside and the middle in order to keep the head from collapsing. Then I glued in the base, weighted it down of course, and we have a dome. That was a close call, that almost didn't work. Now for the eye. I thought I could get away with cutting up an old contact lens solution bottle, and it kinda worked, but I felt like the diameter was just a tad too small. So I just used it for support, glued in some flat surface support to keep it from warping, attached it to the head, and then cut up some 4mm foam to go on the outside of it, thus bulking it up to the proper dimension. Looks like I forgot to heat form that. Oh well, doesn't seem to have made a difference. It's on there anyway. Seams this small, I try to cut at an angle, like at matching angles, so that there's more surface area for the glue to grip onto when they join up. I glued that on top. I love how that looks. Next, I built some of the details behind the eye. These are made from scrap pieces left over from previous builds. I also marked off where the neck would go. It's actually not supposed to be precisely centered. That threw me a bit, but whatever. Then I made the hinges, glued them on, cut some holes for the antenna, did a test fitting with chopsticks. Yeah, it's alright. I left those antenna out for now just because they're gonna get in the way while I paint. Before painting, I filled in some of the seams with putty. Then I set that aside to dry for a bit. While I was waiting, I added some additional details to the limbs, mostly joints and a few bevels to simulate piston muscles. Before connecting all the pieces, I painted them with gray Plastidip. The reason you want to paint it separately is so that the joints don't get glued together. Also, the Plastidip provides a surface on which the top coat can adhere to. Although if I'm being totally honest, I don't think it's necessary to do a primer for this particular droid. They're meant to be a dull, flat brown, so it really doesn't matter if the foam absorbs the paint. Really, I'm just doing it to even out the more brightly colored joint pieces, which are supposed to be the darkest part of the robot. And here's where I realized that I need a new tripod. Hey, support me on Patreon so I can upgrade this gear. Seriously. You'll notice as I'm doing this that the spray paint is eating the styrofoam, the base that it's sitting on, that it's skewered to. I just want to point this out wherever I can so that no first-time makers ever make the mistake of building out a styrofoam and then spray painting it. You'll watch all of your hard work and toil literally melt away before your eyes, like tears in the rain. Alright, Rutger Howard. When it dried, I painted it flat brown. When that dried, I assembled the pieces. Weathering is really up to you. A good general rule is the edges should be metallic because they're most likely to get scratched, and the ditches should be black because that's where dirt and oil collects. And that's how to make a pit droid. Now I can harass Gungans and sabotage pod racers to my heart's content, as well as annoy monarchs.
So how exactly are you both a senator and a queen? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. That sounds like a corrupt form of government if you ask me. I didn't mean it.
Hey, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I want to give a special shout out to my patrons, specifically Martin Madsen, who was very patient in requesting this build. I believe he requested it a long time ago and subtly reminded me. But no, I had a lot of fun with this. This is one of those builds that I've wanted to do for a while, but then I just fall down this lane, this rabbit hole of building lightsabers and helmets, and it ends up getting away from me. But for real, the patrons are the only reason that we get builds that are more complicated than lightsabers and helmets, as well as supplying the budget for the cutaway gags, which personally, I find are the most fun to edit. So if you enjoyed this build and would like to see more of that, consider following the Patreon link in the description down below so I can bring you more awesome content. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, happy crafting, see you later. Wow, almost completely intact. See, that's why I build out of foam.